chairing this session, and it's a great pleasure to introduce Raymond Tallis and Rita, who are going to debate the impact of neurophysiological studies on our conceptions of free will. And I think, Raymond, are you going first?
I think Rita's going first, yes.
Right, okay. They should have half an hour or so each, and that'll leave half an hour for discussion.
Thank you, Simon. I am standing here before you really as a representative of that much maligned group of people, the neuromaniacs. In fact, I can play the I am but a bunch of neurons game to positively Olympic standards. I think Timothy Chappell would think me very sad indeed. However, even I do not think that neuroscience is the only way that we have of understanding ourselves. Such a claim would be absolutely absurd, if only because it would suggest that until we were blessed with neuroscience, we had no grasp of ourselves at all, which is clearly absolutely nonsense. I don't even think that it is the best way to understand ourselves most of the time. Having said that, though, what I do think is that neuroscience in the last 2 or 3 decades has delivered to us some extraordinary new insights and ways of understanding ourselves that were not accessible to us through any other means, including introspection. And some of those, I believe, raise quite serious challenges to the way that we see ourselves as human beings. One of those ways is, I believe, in what is a challenge to our notions of free will. When Raymond Tallis first asked me to do this some weeks ago, I considered it. I hesitated, given the august company that I'm keeping. And then I thought about it again, and I decided that I would do it. I made the decision quite consciously, and as I made it, I had every sense that I could have decided otherwise and done something else. So it seems to me that I am here quite willingly, and I very much hope that you similarly are here quite willingly. Anybody who's not, perhaps you should tell security quickly. So I am not averse to the idea of will in the sense of actions which are undertaken without any obvious external compulsion or constraint. In fact, I think there's more will about than is generally given credence for, actually. My cat has a will. He insists on sitting on the page of the newspaper that I'm trying to read. Seems to be a very deliberate act to me. My car has developed a will recently. It veers to the left for no reason that I can clearly understand. What I am not happy with is the idea that these apparently willful actions are in any proper sense free. Whether it's my car veering to the left, or my cat refusing to let me read the paper, or my and your attendance here today, I believe that it is all determined by preceding events. It's just that some actions don't seem that way, they don't feel like it. We divide actions and behavior basically into 2 types, those which we understand to be the inevitable result of preceding or contingent events, and those that we think are somehow unshackled from the rest of the causal nexus. The sort of things we seem to think are free include things like you and me being here today, possibly my cat sitting on the newspaper, very unlikely to include my cars veering off to the left, let alone something like the passage of a raindrop down a window pane. So what is it that makes us categorize some actions as being free and others not? We seem to think that free actions must be done or are done by living creatures, but not just any living creatures. We make another division there between living creatures that are rather like us and creatures that aren't. I don't think many people ascribe free will to an earwig, for example, but many would to their dog. Furthermore, we don't necessarily think that all actions taken by even people very much like ourselves, other human beings, are necessarily free. That's not enough that they're human either. We wouldn't, for example, think that a person was exercising free will if they were pushed in the street and trod on your toe. Or, for that matter, if they got up while in a deep sleep and travelled some distance and committed murder, which has in fact happened. And indeed, the fact that it is not generally regarded as a free act was reflected in that case by the fact that a court of law actually let that person off when neuroscientists showed that he had marks of a particular form of sleep disruption which might account for what he did. It seems to me that the crucial thing about those acts that we think of as free is that they are accompanied by a conscious thought. And we tend to call those conscious thoughts decisions. Why should consciousness be thought to in any way set us free from causal forces? Well, I suggest the reason is that conscious thought, or conscious thought processes, to be more precise, about future actions generate in us an illusion of choice, because at the time of thinking about them, they can contain ideas about other courses of actions which we are not going to take, along with the course of action that we are going to take. And at the time of thinking of them, they both in our minds have effectively the same status, because we do not at that point in time know for certain what we're going to do. And so it seems to us that we could do either. We just don't know the future. We don't know yet what we're going to do. Hence, we seem able to choose between two futures. And it seems to us that our choices cause the action to happen. Now, there's one thing that we know about cause and effect, at least at the scale of bodies and the level at which we live our lives, is that cause precedes effect. So if this idea is correct, and my conscious decision, say to go left rather than right, is the cause of my subsequently turning left, it figures that the decision must be made before the action is initiated. It's apparently obvious assumption, and it seems to be confirmed countless times every day, and has been since we first became aware of what was happening. We experience a conscious thought, we think wiggle a toe, and lo and behold, our toe wiggles. We're conscious of a desire to sit down and an opportunity to do so. A moment later, we are sitting down. So the conscious urge or desire or decision to wiggle a toe or to sit down is the first thing we know about the action. And we have no reason, therefore, to suppose that there was anything else preceding that thought that caused it to happen. Neuroscience has made visible to us things about the taking of what we think of as voluntary actions, which have not been otherwise accessible to us, things that we could not know just by interrogating our own thoughts. And one of them is that our conscious decisions cannot be the cause of our apparently voluntary actions, because they do not occur before the action has actually started to happen. A mention has been made several times already to the work of Benjamin Libet, and I expect that practically everybody in the room is familiar with it. But just in case there are some people who are not, or indeed if you have forgotten the details of it, I just want to go through it again. This is Benjamin Libet, American neuroscientist, died a few years ago. In 1983, in the early 80s, he was doing a series of experiments which were concerned with the timing of conscious events, or mental events rather, which were involved in voluntary actions. By voluntary, he meant acts which were accompanied by a conscious thought or an urge to act. He knew already that the brain needs a measurable amount of time to organize an action, even a very simple one like flexing a wrist. Because all sorts of unconscious processes have to happen. You have to, the brain has to develop an action scheme and get it translated into terms that can be sent by the motor cortex down to the relevant muscles and so on. He also knew from previous work, not his own, but others, that the start of these unconscious processes are marked by a distinctive wave of neural activity, which is called the readiness potential. The readiness potential is peculiar to those actions that we call voluntary, those that we make consciously. It doesn't seem to occur in reflex actions. It doesn't seem to occur before the sort of actions that are made by people with Tourette's syndrome, for example, tics and expletives and so on, which they do not experience as being self-initiated. So, Libet had three distinct things which he wanted to fix in time. One was the conscious decision. Another was the readiness potential, the beginning of the unconscious brain processes which organize and finally execute a physical movement. And finally, the movement itself, the contraction of the appropriate muscles. And the way that Libet went about getting this fix in time was what looks today like rather a crude experiment, but has proved to be remarkably robust. Student volunteers, they were fitted with an EEG cap, which was placed in such a way as to pick up the readiness potential. They were also fitted with a sensor that picked up the contraction of the muscles at the wrist. And they were asked to observe a very large analog clock face, which had a sweep, a dot actually, that swept around the face twice a second, which is just the speed which you can get a good fix on. It's not too fast to trace, you can follow it accurately, and you can use it to make rather precise timings. The students were then left in the laboratory and asked to make a simple hand movement to flex their wrist when they felt like it. The important thing was that the action should be self-initiated. They were not going to get some external cue as to when to do it. The timing devices associated with this setup were deceptively simple. The EEG and the muscle contraction sensor were simply time-locked to something that registered the timing of events, and the students were asked to watch the clock face and mark in their own heads for report later when, the precise moment when the conscious urge, what we would generally, I think, regard as a decision to move, was made in their heads, and this they duly did. Now, as we said, it seems intuitively, from what we can gather from introspection, that willed actions are kicked off by our conscious thoughts to do them. So it would seem likely, it certainly did at the time, that the order in which these three events would pan out would be that the conscious thought, the decision, would come first, followed by the readiness potential, showing that the brain was getting ready to execute it, and finally the act itself. But what Libet found instead was that the students, who were of course unaware of the RP, which is an unconscious process, consistently reported making the decision to act after the RP had started. The reports were consistent over hundreds of trials. In nearly every case, the subject said that that conscious urge to act, or the decision to move, depending on how you want to interpret it, occurred about 0.3 of a second after the EEG showed the readiness potential. The movement itself then took place a further 0.2 or so of a second after that. In other words, by the time they consciously decided to act, their brain was already getting ready to do it. It was already actually doing the act. Now, if this is correct, and it is unconscious brain processes that initiate actions, presumably in response to various external, internally generated cues, conscious decisions are not what they seem to be. Rather than deciding and kicking off our actions, they seem to be merely observations, privileged insights, if you like, into what our body is doing anyway. We inside get to see what it's about just a split second before it becomes obvious to the outside world. Now, if this is true of all actions, and not just hand waving in the laboratory, then it does follow, I think, that our behavior is simply the end product of a lot of autonomous brain processes. However, the intuition that our conscious minds are the cause of our actions is so deeply entrenched in all of us, I think, that the response of many people is simply to say, Libet must be wrong. Now, I won't go into that here, but all I will say is that those experiments, which were done originally in 1983, have been replicated since many, many times using much more sophisticated equipment. And as I say, they have been shown to be remarkably robust. In fact, more recent experiments along the same line suggest that, in fact, the conscious urge lags even further than Libet found behind the actual initiation of an action. Interesting, Libet himself was one of those who found the results of his work to be very hard to take. And he came up with something that was mentioned yesterday, the idea of free won't rather than free will. Basically, the idea being that even if you don't actually kick off an action, what you do have is that 1.5 seconds or so after the conscious thought where you can inhibit the action, so you can stop things. Well, that would be okay, but you would expect in that case not to see the same unconscious processes preceding the inhibitory activity as you see in those that precede the initiation, the first initiation. And in fact, you don't when you look at what is happening in the brains of people who are inhibiting actions at the last moment. You see that those actions too, the inhibition is preceded similarly by a readiness potential. Anyway, it would be very strange, would it not, that negative actions should be so different from positive ones? And how do you decide what a negative action is? I mean, what, for example, if the veto, the free won't we're looking at is, say, my decision not to eat the last chocolate on the plate? What if I make that in that 1.5 seconds just before I put it in my mouth? Would putting the chocolate down somehow be achieved without a readiness potential, just because it related to an activity that was underway? It all seems very unlikely. And there are some studies which I haven't got time to go into, but I do have some studies which demonstrate readiness potentials occurring for inhibitory activities as well. Now, if you will grant me just for the moment that the results of this study are correct, and that physical human actions are initiated by unconscious brain processes, the next question that seems to arise is, so what? Does it really tell us anything important? Does it alter our view of ourselves in any important way? Is it anything to do with anything? Well, I would argue that yes, it is. It's very important indeed, both in terms of altering our view of ourselves as human beings and our place in the world, and also because it has quite practical implications for the way that we live our lives. As far as shifting our view of ourselves, it seems to me that so long as we believe that our conscious processes are free, that is quite independent of the forces that are acting on the rest of the material world, we are effectively divorcing ourselves from the rest of the world. We are adopting those connotations of superiority that Andrew referred to in his introduction to the conference. I believe that this is a conceit on our parts, comparable to that which for so long led us to think that the sun revolved around the earth. And I think that the general abandonment of the notion of free will is or will be the completion of that process of unseating ourselves from the center of the universe. Now, it's kind of discomforting, of course, but comfort is not a good reason for hanging on to ideas which are wrong, and especially if those ideas have real effects in the world, and bad ones at that. Because the beliefs and ideas that we hold in our brains are themselves stimuli which affect our actions and help to structure, therefore, the rules by which we live. At present, our society, and in particular our legal system, is built on our intuitive sense of volition that I believe neuroscience is challenging. The illusion convinces us that when people do something wrong, they could have done otherwise. It was a matter of choice. Therefore, they're culpable. And that leads us furthermore to think the same of ourselves. We could have done something else. It seems that we had a choice. And so that leads us to the perfectly sensible conclusion that wrong things, our own as well as those of others, should be punished. Well, punishment isn't necessarily a bad thing because it often acts as a deterrent and a way of, if you like, training the will to be better. But the trouble is that our belief in free will, I believe, often leads us to punish primarily to hurt the wrongdoer rather than to prevent further wrongdoing. Recognizing that wrongdoing is not a choice, not just among those that we hold already not to be of sound mind, but actually for any of us, would make, I believe, for a kinder society, without obliging us to abandon punishment as a means of deterrence. And it would make us kinder to ourselves, too. David Papineau yesterday gave the example of how knowledge of the neurological processes underlying alcoholism have given him a different view and perhaps a greater understanding of people with that particular problem. A wider recognition that alcoholics are pushed by different pressures than others might, I think, help us also to develop, in a very practical way, better ways of treating and dealing with people with that problem and others like it. Having said that, a complete sort of embracing of the notion that we have no free will clearly does have dangers. I don't think it's like to lead to the conviction that life is not worth living. I genuinely don't believe in free will, including my own, but I do feel most of the time that life is pretty much worth living. And in fact, in practical terms, it makes very little difference to the way I behave, rather sadly, actually. However, that's not to say that it does not make any difference. The belief that we are agents is a useful one. And indeed, I suspect that the neural processes that gave rise to it probably evolved precisely because it is useful. It's useful because it does two things. It acts as a stimulus to action, and it also encourages people to take responsibility for their own actions and therefore to inhibit those which are harmful to others. And in a species that's so densely interdependent as our own, that is undoubtedly very important and a very good thing. And now there is empirical evidence on this matter of whether the belief in free will actually affects behavior. For example, in one experiment, it was found that if you subject a group of people to neuropropaganda, the sort of thing you're hearing now, they are subsequently less motivated to act in a socially and generally beneficial way. The experiment, very briefly, is that they took two groups of people. One was subjected, as I say, to, it's actually a passage from Crick's book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, whereas another read some neutral text. And then they were asked to do a test. They were left alone in a room to do a test on a computer. And the experimenters apparently let on as they were leaving that there was a bit of a glitch in the program and that they could actually cheat. If they pressed the space bar, they would see the answer, but please don't do it. We can't check whether you've done it or not, but you're on your honor not to do it. And it was found that a significant number of people in the group that had been subjected to the neuropropaganda cheated than those who had read a neutral text. I guess worse than that, actually. There's another study that suggests that abandoning belief in free will reduces your motivation to do anything at all. Sort of starts to nudge you towards some sort of fatalistic sort of passivity. A similar experiment, volunteers were invited to do some willed action, and again divided into a group that was subjected to neuropropaganda and a group that wasn't. And the researchers subsequently measured the enthusiasm with which they did the willed action, but they measured it by looking again at the readiness potential. They went inside the brain and looked at how strong the brain's unconscious processes involved in initiating the action were, and compared the two groups, and found that the readiness potential was actually diminished in those people who had been subjected to arguments against free will. So in other words, the erosion of belief in their own will was in fact self-fulfilling. So the idea that free will is an illusion is potentially a dangerous one, and that of course presents problems, sticky problems for those of us who believe in it. David Papineau suggests there's a way out of this. By working very hard, we might find some way to preserve the good bits of a non-materialistic philosophy, meaning, value, and so on. I hope that can be done. I don't know. What I do know is that I think it's a little bit like making an omelette. You really do have to break the eggs first. Thank you very much.
Just talk amongst yourselves while I swap over the slides. And now let me just look. Now, which knob do I press for? Anybody into the knob pressing? Oh, thank you, Rita. Thank you. Not at all, not at all. Absolutely. You had no choice.
I don't.
That was a cheap shot, wasn't it?
Very. And Colin just say no. Why do I pretend to understand?
I just need to get. That's the one. It just needs to be
Oh,
brought
I
up.
see, okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
So you just need to bring the thing to there, but I don't know what happens. Oh, that's it.
There you go.
Yep, lovely. Oh, thank you much indeed. Thank you. And then it has to be made a bit bigger. Yep, it just needs to be made a bit bigger so you don't see what's coming next. The trouble is I'm trying to move. It's got a funny thingy bob. Rita, could you come up again, do you think? Yeah. F5. Wait a moment, F5 blocks it out, doesn't it?
Oh, wait a minute. If you
F5.
up the slide check bit.
That was F5. Oh, thank you much indeed. Thank you. A hand from my assistant. Thank you much indeed. Thank you. Great. Well, you'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to pack into my 30 minutes a comprehensive review of the arguments for and against the belief that we humans have free will. Nor do I intend to cover all of the neuroscientific literature that is thought to bear on this question. But I'm going to focus on some key experiments, particularly the one that Rita has already spoken about, in order to challenge the claim that neuroscience brings something special or new to the ancient arguments about whether or not we are free agents or agents at all. I'm going to challenge the notion that the discoveries of neuroscience have demonstrated that we are either not as free as we thought we were or not free at all. The idea that thanks to brain research, we now know to be true on the basis of empirical evidence what hitherto philosophers and others only feared might be true on the basis of arguments. I guess I'm not the only one in the audience or in this room who thinks there is something slightly dodgy about the claim that empirical science can address essentially metaphysical questions, such as whether or not human freedom is real. And I hope I shall have time to examine the assumption, I press the knob down, in this recently published book, that the metaphysically interesting question in the problem of free will and determinism boils down to a straightforward and wide-open empirical question about the causal histories of certain neural events. It seems difficult to me not to believe that if the arguments for incompatibilist determinism were sound, it doesn't seem to be necessary to require any data to support them, but that's another issue. Now, my critique of the conclusions drawn from the experiments of people like Benjamin Libet, and also experiments that Rita alluded to but didn't discuss by John Dillon Hayes, will involve highlighting some of the features that correctly characterize that subclass of events we're inclined to call actions, actions originating from agents rather than mere effects of prior causes. Now, many of those features are not the kind of things one would expect to discover inside the brains of actors. So the failure to find the basis of agency in the brain is not evidence that agency is an illusion, it's evidence that you're looking in the wrong place. By specifying the nature of actions, my critique of neurodeterminism will contribute incidentally to a critique of determinism, period. It will also provide another reason for concluding that persons are not identical with brains, additional to those that we discussed yesterday. Now, neurodeterminism is, of course, wedded to the idea that our minds are our brains are evolved organs designed, as are all organs, by natural selection to maximize the replicative ability of the genes, whose tool the brain is. We're largely unaware of this, and for many this means that we're acting out a biological script at odds with the humanist story we tell ourselves about ourselves as conscious agents. The eminent neurophysiologist Colin Blakemore expressed this view with admirable lucidity in his Rita lectures many years ago. The human brain, he said, is a machine which alone accounts for all our actions, our most private thoughts, our beliefs. All our actions are the products of the activity of our brains. It makes no sense in scientific terms to try to distinguish sharply between acts, still using the word acts, that result from conscious attention and those that result from our reflexes or are caused by disease or damage to the brain. So, if we are identical with our brains or with certain neural discharges in them, we must be just as unfree as when we are writing a textbook about the management of epilepsy, as I've done, or giving a Rita lecture on the brain, as Colin has, as when we are, for example, in the grip of an epileptic seizure. It makes no sense in neuroscientific terms to distinguish between these things. Now, there is no fundamental difference, in other words, between, say, having a blackout, taking careful steps to deal with one's blackouts, or writing a textbook on blackouts, or indeed between any of these things and the fall of a pebble, or indeed of a raindrop that Rita mentioned. Now, other writers are not so radical or so consistent as Colin. They want only to tone down what they feel to be our exaggerated sense of our own autonomy by picking away empirically at what we traditionally regard as freely chosen behavior. They have highlighted how conscious awareness of actions and processes lags behind the processes themselves, something that we'll come back to that Rita was talking about. How people often mistake why they perform certain actions. How our actions are often significantly influenced by situational factors that seem intuitive and unimportant, and how conscious choices can be influenced by brain stimulation. And all of this has seemed to justify, to some, the conclusion that we don't will our actions. And indeed, according to Sam Harris, given that thoughts and intentions emerge from background causes of which we are unaware and over which we exert no conscious control, free will is an illusion. Or somewhat more modestly, as Daniel Wegner argues, the only connection between willing and acting is that both come from the same unconscious source. Now, as I've already said, I don't have time to address this vast literature, but I want to illustrate the problems with the apparent empirical support for neurodeterminism with two connected studies, carried out a quarter of a century apart, which have been very widely cited and very widely discussed within neuroscience and philosophy, and have attracted the attention of the popular press and the wider public, because they seem to challenge, as Rita has indicated, the notion that we're in charge of our actions. These two studies will illustrate most of the points of philosophical interest I want to make. The first is a famous set of experiments that Rita has spoken about, carried out by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, repeated and refined, as she said, many times since then, which seem to show that our brain makes decisions to act before our conscious mind is aware of them. So they're not really our decisions at all. And the neuroscientist and philosopher Patrick Haggard described the paper in which they were first described as one of the most philosophically challenging in modern scientific psychology. So I'm going to go over again what Libet did and what he found, even though Rita has described it very beautifully. But I just remind you, in a typical experiment, Libet's subjects are instructed to make a simple movement, I beg your pardon, to bend their right wrist or the fingers of their right hand in their own time. Then, using an EEG, the experimenter records the activity in the brain that indicates a readiness to move, the so-called readiness potential, or right shaft potential, as it was first described. And this potential is seen in the part of the cerebral cortex that neurophysiologists most closely associate with voluntary movement. The readiness potential occurs about half a second before activity in the relevant muscles of the arm or hand, as recorded by an EMG, because of course it takes time for neural activity in the cortex to translate into events in the relevant muscles. Nothing worrying there. But, as Rita has said, Libet made another observation that seemed to raise serious questions. He asked his subjects to recall the position of the spot revolving round a clock face in order to determine the time when they were first aware of their urge or intention or decision to make a movement. To his surprise, he found that the readiness potential occurred a consistent third of a second before the time at which the subjects reported being aware of the decision to move. And he concluded from this that the brain, not the subject or the person, decided to initiate, or at least to prepare to initiate the act before there was any reportable subjective awareness of a decision having been taken. Put more simply, the cerebral causes of our actions seem to occur before our conscious awareness of deciding to perform them. Now, these findings are open to a range of interpretations, but they cannot be dismissed as mere artifacts of the method of recording, though as has recently been shown, we infer rather than perceive the moment we decide to act. Nor can the gap between the electrical signal of the initiation of action, the readiness potential, and the awareness of the intention to perform the action be explained away as the interval between forming an intention and being sufficiently reflectively aware of the intention to allocate it to a particular time. And this has been demonstrated rather dramatically by more recent work, this time using functional magnetic resonance imaging. Dylan Hayes and colleagues carried out studies in which a succession of letters were displayed on a screen. Subjects were asked to press a left or a right button at the moment of their own choosing, and to note the letter which was being displayed at the time that they felt they were making a decision to press the button. The letter was a time marker. Two regions that lit up on the brain predicted whether the subject was going to choose the left button or the right button. The scientists seemed to know it in advance of the subject. Remarkably, the regions in question lit up a full 5 seconds before the individual was aware of having made a choice. Moreover, there were other areas in the frontal cortex, traditionally ascribed executive powers, that were active no less than 7 seconds before awareness of the decision. What's more, if the delay in the response of the scanner detecting the relevant activity was accounted for, the interval increased to 10 seconds. Such a delay could not be ascribed to the subject mistiming the intention to move. The authors concluded something rather interesting. There is a network of high-level control areas in the brain that begins to prepare an upcoming decision long before it enters awareness. It looks like we don't know what we're doing until we've found we've done it. Libet's original interpretation, as Rita again has said, of his own experiments was that they demonstrated we don't have free will, the brain decides to move, the brain initiates movement. But, Libet says, if the act now process is initiated unconsciously, then the conscious free will is not doing it. But we do have free won't. We can inhibit movements that are initiated by the brain. But Rita's already, I think, undermined that interpretation. But Libet was implying we don't quite initiate voluntary movements, rather we select and control them, either by permitting the movement that arises out of an unconsciously initiated process, or by, as he says, vetoing progress to actual motor activation. And this has been expressed as our ability to rubber stamp decisions that have already been made by neural networks. It's not clear, however, why this decision should require rubber stamping. In the personless world of neuroscience, it makes no sense for us to rubber stamp the decisions of our brain than for a falling pebble to endorse the gravitational field. What's shocking to some about the Libet and Dillon Hayes experiment is that the brain activity seems to precede the intention, precisely what Rita was pointing out. Things are in the wrong order. It suggests, therefore, that the brain activity causes the intention, contradicting the view that the intention should precede the brain activity in order that it could cause it. This is wrong in many ways, but I want to focus on what are, to me, the most important errors which arise out of the notion, important errors in this interpretation, which arise out of the notion that actions belong to a linear causal chain of events, and that a truly voluntary action would be one in which a special kind of cause, a little deus ex machina, slipped into the causal chain, an intention that would then precede motor activity corresponding to the action. The mistake is to think of the action being defined in third-person terms by the motor activity of which it is composed, and then to fail to understand actions in first-person and holistic terms as belonging not to a causal thread, interrupted or appropriated by volition, but as part of a field defined by the agent operating within a world of meanings that are inseparable from what he or she is. To pursue this, we need not only to look at the action that Libert's subjects were asked to perform, but also to fill in some of the human, social context in which they performed it. As many other writers have pointed out, and there's no claim to originality in what follows, the action was the simplest imaginable, a flexing of the wrist, a mere movement. The movement, however, itself was only a minute part of a long sequence of movements amounting to a large-scale action, which could be described as taking part in Dr. Libert's experiment. Now, this large-scale action began at least as far back as getting up in the morning to visit Dr. Libert's laboratory, after perhaps setting the alarm to make sure one wasn't late. It involved consenting to take part in an experiment whose nature and purpose and safety was fully understood. And it required, among many other things, listening to and understanding and agreeing to the instructions that were received, and then deciding to flex the wrist. In other words, the immediate prior intention, the psychological event timed by the subjects, was not the whole story of the action, only a tiny part of it. It was preceded by many others that were minutes, hours, perhaps days before the action. The real story of a human action, in this case flexing the wrist, is not just that movement, but of a sustained and complex resolve being maintained over a very long time. And this encompasses many large items of behavior: getting on and off buses, looking for the laboratory, being cross because there's no parking space, cancelling or declining other commitments so as not to let Dr. Libet down, and so on. These are things, of course, that have many hundreds of thousands of motor components. Now, once this is appreciated, then the temporal relation between the last step, the wrist flexing, and the readiness potential is seen in the lab becomes unimportant. The decision to participate in the experiment, which alone gave the wrist flexion its meaning, began not milliseconds, not seconds or minutes, but hours, days, perhaps weeks before the wrist was flexed. Weeks, perhaps, when the patient decided to become a subject in the experiment. The flexing of the wrist is just the last component of an action called taking part in Dr. Libet's experiment, which would itself be part of a greater intentional whole, such as, for example, wanting to please Dr. Libet, or wanting to help those clever scientists understand the brain, as it might one day help doctors to treat my child's brain injury more effectively. It now seems less disturbing, or less exciting according to your taste, that the readiness potential preceded the intention to make a movement by a mere 300 to 450 milliseconds, or the brain activity seen on the scan in Dillon Hayes' experiment was up to 10 seconds in advance of the experienced intention. The specific intention to flex the wrist belongs to a much wider field of intention, which has temporal depth and existential extensity, and is connected with great swathes of the acting individual's self-world, including know-how, know-that, motives, principles, and so on. As Tim Crane has expressed it, our actions are interconnected, as are our intentions, decisions, and plans. The fact that decisions in the Libet experiment seem to follow the action is also irrelevant, Crane argues, because our actions unfold without there being explicit decisions, except broad brush ones. We don't make decisions at every point, at every node. When I'm walking to the pub to meet you, there isn't a separate decision corresponding to every one of the 100 steps I take to get there. Libet's experiment illustrates how the neurodeterminist and indeed the determinist case against freedom is rooted in a very distorted conception of what constitutes an action in everyday life, and it shows us what is suspect about determinism more broadly construed. If you want to make voluntary actions seem involuntary, the first thing you've got to do is strip away their context, remove the self from which they originate, remove the nexus of meanings that is the world to which they're addressed, and then effectively break them down into their physical elements. This gets you well on the way to eliminating the difference between a twitch and a deliberate action, or between, say, my involuntarily taking part in the experiment, having been carried to the laboratory in a coma, and my participating in it because I want to help those clever scientists. It's possible to take this denaturing of actions even further. I can, for example, break up the process of giving this lecture into physiological events, such as the formation and rupture of cross bridges in the fibers of my articulatory muscles. It's perfectly obvious I can't do any of this. I wouldn't know how to make a muscle cross bridge break and join together if I tried. But it doesn't follow from this that I'm not giving this lecture freely, or that I'm not really intending to give it, or that it has no relation to my intentions during the days when I wrote it. All that follows is that atoms of action, stripped of a framework of meaning, cannot be specifically intended, and that is no great shock. But because actions are not made of contextless atomic movements, they are indissoluble wholes, synthesized and regulated by higher order intentions that issue, of course, not from bodies, but from persons who are engaged in the community of minds. And of course, Libertas' laboratory, Libertas' experiment is a perfect example of the operation of the community of mind, which is our natural habitat. And it's this that embeds actions in a first-person reality that is not reducible to third-person or no-person material events. And let me develop this a little bit further. The intention of the person who's asked to flex her wrist in life, as in Libertas' lab, is aimed not at the movement itself, but at the goal of the movement, or the nested goals of the movement, to do as Dr. Libertas requested, to cooperate with the experiment, to help to advance science, to bring a cure for brain disease closer. The person participating in the experiment, or at least the participation in the experiment, originates in a huge space of possibility, a human world to which the self is addressed. That is the theatre of the activity of a person, a theatre which has been fashioned out of the pooling of our consciousness through shared attention. In the case of Libertas' experiments, that world includes the institution of science, the person's understanding of it, and their attitude towards scientific research, which is interested and sympathetic enough for that person to be willing to give up her time to participate in experiments that make sense to her and look as if they may advance knowledge. It's this self-world, which is irreducible, which provides the framework and theatre and rationale of the action of flexing the wrist. It's a boundless hinterland of meanings, and we have to dig deep and go through many layers before we eventually reach a kind of biological or material bedrock. And it's here, in these layers, that we are to find the locus of our free will, not in some delimited portion of the causal nexus, plugged into the remainder of the causal nexus. And it's scarcely surprising, therefore, we cannot find freedom or free will or an expression of free will in an isolated movement observed in a brain in a laboratory, which treats actions as if they were material events with simple proximate causes and simple proximate effects. The locus of free will is a field of intention, rooted in the self and its world, that extends way beyond any particular moment in a laboratory. And it's because our actions are irreducibly complex that the simple notion of a cause, cerebral or otherwise, loses its grip on them. So they're not mere effects. What is your cause of your attending this talk? What material cause would you invoke? You may say swathes of my entire past. But such a swathe, combining know-how, know-that, reasons, motives, etc., is hardly something corresponding to a cause. And if it were, it would be interesting to know who or what gathered up all those things so that it was able to act as a cause. If it was I who gathered them up, then we're a long way from the notion of the causation of my actions being something somehow outside of me. The idea of myself as a cause of my actions, or of my actions as an expression of myself, is close, of course, to the idea of freedom. Now, while we concede that our past and the sense of the future that informs is deeply implicated in our actions, it's equally a mistake to think of the past, or indeed a subset of past states, as a mere cause of that of which we are passive effects. For a start, the past or parts of it is there as an explicit present. Just think of the million components of know that and know how and so on necessary for me to learn about Dr. Libertas' experiments, to decide to participate them and succeed in doing so. The temptation to see all this as a deposit of effects in my brain that then become causes can be resisted when we realize that they have somehow to be brought together to act upon me. The only way of synthesizing the disparate elements so that they operate as a full-blown occasion for an action is through a sustained, forward-looking, explicit intention. In short, not through causes pushing from behind, but through reasons pulling from front. And reasons don't grow out of some putative biological substrate, but are a forward-looking affirmation of, assertion of, or expression of myself. Now, the countless events which are subsumed in reasons for actions cannot be generated, requisitioned, orchestrated by ordinary causation, or by processes of the kind that are described in neuroscience. And it's wrong for the same reason to imagine that the orchestration of a multitude of movements and thoughts rooted in knowledge and emotion could be achieved by biological drives or by motives that are themselves seen as quasi-material causes. Now, it's easy to see why committed determinists, including neurodeterminists, want to think of actions as caused, because it prepares them to be reinserted into a long causal chain extending backwards from a present material event to the Big Bang. It's wrong. A journey to Oxford to attend a meeting is a succession of movements, but it's more than that, which is why there is a difference between moving and travelling. Actions are not, and could not be caused, in the narrow atomic linear sense implied in the term cause. To see actions aright, we have to invoke the notion of explicit purpose, which pulls us towards goals that we have ourselves envisaged, articulated, and which shapes the succession of action components we undertake. This is the hidden nerve of association, gluing together the myriad subroutines that make up the components of behavior, the countless elements that comprise ordinary-sized actions, such as taking a train to Oxford, and the innumerable actions that make up our lives, which we consciously and often effortfully lead rather than merely organically or materially live or experience. To reduce reasons to, or absorb them into mere surface expressions of material or biological motors, such as motives, instincts, or drives, never mind unconscious ditto, is not only to misrepresent them, but also to remove their explanatory force, and to deprive complex but utterly ordinary actions of any kind of explanation. The action of going to the Royal College of Physicians to make the case for improving epilepsy services, which is something I've done on many occasions, could not be driven in this way, because its goal and content are utterly singular and are rooted in a very complex, private, understood, and recollected personal past. In short, actions are expressive of a self operating in a world, rather than a series of motor events arising in an organism out of prior material events. Their organization requires that they should be transilluminated by conscious intentions that make sense to the actor in the light of his or her past life and envisaged future. Reinserting our actions back into the chains of cause and effects that make up the material world, by breaking them into small components, not only reduces them to mere movements, but also imprisons them in a tenseless present. It denies their temporal depth, which has at least two dimensions. The most obvious is the forward and backward connectedness of the components necessary to make sense of them, and hence to make sense of the fact that they have occurred. For example, the complex movements involved in locking and bolting my front door are intelligible only in relation to my having come out of my house and my intention to leave the house empty while I'm in Oxford. And there is the additional dimension, which comes from the past self and the envisaged future self, from which the trip to Oxford draws its meaning and motivation. These two temporal dimensions are a particularly sophisticated elaboration of the intentionality or aboutness that characterizes mental phenomena. Indeed, it is the orchestration of this aboutness that links the components of my action, to borrow a phrase from Roger, the components into a kind of virtual causal chain, as opposed to a conventional causal chain. A connectedness that is in another dimension from that of the material interactions of, say, my body and the pavement when I'm propelling myself to the railway station. Actions are events that we could not conceive of happening without their making sense to an agent. Now, there will still be some who are unimpressed by these arguments because freedom doesn't fit with what they believe to be the scientific world picture, on the grounds that what science can't see isn't real. Well, to the latter, I end by offering this question, and it's one that Rita has addressed. If freedom really were an illusion, where on earth did the illusion come from, particularly such a tenacious one? Why, if material causation, such as connects one nerve impulse with another, or nerve impulses with energy impinging on sense endings, if this reigns unchecked and undeviated, why should one section of an infinite causal nexus of the universe declare, apparently without foundation, that it is itself a point of origin of certain events, actions, that are not simply part of that endless chain of causes, whose ancestry ultimately lies in the Big Bang? It seems a very odd idea for a bit of the causal net to entertain. There is an inevitably Darwinian response, and one that Rita has hinted at. Anything is possible if it is of adaptive value. The sense that I'm the source of my actions, we're told, gives me an enhanced potency, and also by making me feel responsible for certain events that I deem to be my actions, makes me ethically more biddable. I can, for example, feel shame. As Rita herself says, the illusion of free will is deeply ingrained, precisely because it prevents us from falling into a suicidally fatalistic state of mind, and it's one of the brain's most powerful aids to survival. This is an interesting claim because it suggests that our belief that we are free, notwithstanding it's an illusion, can after all alter what happens in the world, initially so far as we're concerned. It can indeed alter it for the better because it helps us to survive. In short, the illusion of free will does deflect the course of events, and hence must be self-fulfilling, something that Rita herself hinted at, in which case, of course, it's not an illusion. For if we really cannot deflect the course of predetermined events, including our behavior, then the idea that we are free cannot change anything, any more than the idea we're not free can change it. One parting observation. Why do we take neuroscience as the last word on what is real? Why do we feel if we can't see it in the brain, it isn't real? If you can't find agency in the brain, or neuroscience throws questions on agency, why do we say that agency or free will is looking questionable? After all, neuroscience isn't the last word. Physics is more fundamental. And looked at from the standpoint of quantum mechanics, stable, solid objects are an illusion. That includes the brain. So let me round off by concluding that what neuroscience brings to the party is not so much new data relevant to the question of whether free will is possible, but a set of inherited assumptions derived from the biological framework and from the materialist ontology embedded within it, from which it approaches the person, the mind, and the consciousness. These assumptions, particularly in the form of the belief that persons are identical with their brains, are ill-founded, as we've already discussed. I rest my case.
Okay, the floor is open for questions. Gosh. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could ask a quick question of each of you. So first for Rita, at a certain point in your talk, you were describing what's happening with readiness potentials and all that sort of thing. And you described it in one sentence as getting ready to act, and then the next sentence as already doing the act, as if those were synonymous. So I was wondering, is that a slip of the tongue, or do you really think those are synonymous? It sure seems like they're not necessarily the same thing. When I put on my tennis shoes to go for a run or whatnot, I'm getting ready to act, but I'm not running, right? And if getting ready to act is really an adequate way of describing or interpreting what's going on with the readiness potentials, I'm not quite sure I'm seeing why the result should be necessarily a challenge to free will. I mean, why shouldn't I just believe that if I'm acting freely, my brain has to, a certain subconscious process that makes that choice available to me has to happen first. And why does that have to be a conflict? So if you speak to that. And then for Professor Tallis, I wasn't quite clear what all this, what did you call it, field of intentions or whatever it was is relevant exactly. So and I could see how all the background and being an intentional subject in an experiment is maybe relevant to whether I choose to wiggle my wrist or not. But the design of the experiment foregrounds the timing, right? And none of that other prior stuff speaks to exactly when I will move my wrist. So why is all that other background even relevant? So, thanks.
The first point about when is an act an act, when does it begin and end, I think it's just how you define what the act is. If you think that it's the contraction of the muscle, it starts.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, sir. I think it's just a matter of what what act are we talking about? And I'm sorry, I was slip sliding around probably because I don't think it mattered. I should remember. But if you decide that the action begins when the muscle contracts, then that's when it begins. I did slip to saying that when the processes in the brain readiness potential was the start of the action. You can see it differently if you don't want to. I mean, it doesn't seem to me, I don't quite see what the importance of it is. Am I missing something? And the second bit just seems to repeat the question, sort of why, as far as I could make out, you say, why can't I be acting freely even if my body is starting to do something? Why can it still not be free? I mean, I can't really add to that except what I've said already. It doesn't seem, it's a strange sort of freedom to me. It seems to be stretching the word in a way that I don't naturally understand it.
Oh, thank you. I mean, there's something modestly ambitious in my talk, something a bit more ambitious, but just to focus on the less ambitious part of my talk, is the big question is, does something like a Libertas experiment cut any metaphysical ice in terms of the question of free will? And I would say that when you look at the experiment, you've got to look at the experiment at the whole situation in which the person is operating. And that person is operating not just in that immediate moment when they're bending their wrist. What's happening, or rather what they're doing, belongs to something much bigger. So the fact that the readiness potential is 450 milliseconds prior to their sense of forming a particular intention to move their wrist is neither here nor there. They're already in a great field of intention. One is to help Dr. Libertas. And that's a much bigger field of intention. And those are the kinds of fields of intention within which we operate. We don't perform atomic movements in that sort of way. Actually, I mean, this is nothing original about this. Existentialists are talking about this, and Merleau-Ponty and so on. We're talking about this ages ago. So it seems to me that what is missing in the Libertas experiment or the radical interpretations of those experiments is an understanding of the nature of an action and all the things, the hinterland, the tangled backstory of every action, which we synthesize as human beings, as persons, as selves.
Lady in red. I'm afraid this is rather arbitrary. I'm getting a forest of hands at each possible.
Thank you very much for very interesting talks. So I'm Linda Fisher-Hoyron from Brooks University, and I think after kind of listening to both of you, what I'm wondering about is the whole idea of causation, because it seems to be that what defines how you tell your story about free will is your understanding of causation. So Rita Carter, you had I guess a more Humean understanding of like a linear kind of cause and effect way of describing what's happening, while Raymond Tallis has a different one where he includes different notions of causation. And so I guess my question is like, why are we obliged to go with the kind of a Humean way of understanding causation, and what would happen if we were to take a different approach, say either a kind of a Buddhist view of dependent origination in how they understand causation, or an Aristotelian Thomistic view, which I think would align, I guess, with the story that Raymond Tallis was saying, where you have a richer notion of causation. Yeah, is that correct?
I think there are two dimensions to it. One is I was picking up on Rita's observation that basically we all feel that if intentions were causes of actions, then they ought to basically occur before the brain prepares for an action. And I was saying, well, that order, that temporal order, actually, it's a bit artificial, because actually the intentions are well in place, broad intentions, for weeks, days, and so on and so forth. So I was sort of undermining one aspect of Rita's view, which was that there was a causal order that was very upsetting, that it would appear that causes always having temporal priority effects, that the cause appeared to be, the first thing was brain activity. And that's worrying. And I'm saying, not at all. The first thing is Mrs. Smith getting up in the morning thinking, blimey, I'm late for Dr. Libertas' experiment, and so on. And the second thing is causes, going back to sort of Aristotelian views and so on, but causes only work in the context of conditions. And it seems to me what I would say is if you can have a story about a thin narrative of linear causation, but that doesn't in any way capture the truth of human life and human actions, where we have to think about conditions in a very, very broad, very, very fast sense. And I was drawing together some of the conditions. So that was the more ambitious bit of my talk, and perhaps more vulnerable. Yeah.
Yes, next to the, yes.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Hercules, and I'm from Greece, University of Crete. Thank you for the talks. Well, I'd like to make a remark taken by Christine Koskard about the distinction between the phrase, the name act and action. Christine Koskard actually mentions that acts are what Aristotle said simple acts, just to take my hand and grasp a bottle of wine. This is an act. An action has a normative significance. It means that we take the wine in order to get drunk, for example. Just a simple example. So what I realized here is that we make the category mistake that Professor Hake yesterday made, that we all turn in a description of acts and make some results about actions. We take the description of act in order to account about actions. And that's a problem there. Also, Christine Koskard makes a nice quotation about the distance that deliberation and reflection, the activity of reason, gives to human persons. It gives the ability to stand opposed to the experience and the act and to choose. So this is not the same kind of reflexive time distance that the nervous system has. It's something normatively distant, not neurally distant. So to take an example, and not to take your time, is
could you be sure to get to your question,
yes.
please?
The question is, I want a conclusion, is that if, for example, we take the example of somebody killing another person, I think that Mrs. Carter would say that he would take the knife and stab it into his heart, and just after 250 milliseconds away, he will realize he would do it. And if I quote Barry Smith yesterday, the other person who received the knife would feel the knife 250 milliseconds before actually the knife entered his heart. But Mrs. Carter said that he will just stab the knife in his heart, and I think Mr. Tallis said that he will lethally traumatize him, but nobody actually said that he will kill him, and that's the normative.
Thank you. Do we have any answers to that?
I'm spending a bit way much on that, so I'm not a philosopher of action, so I'm a bit out of my depth.
I think it should be accepted that actions very often have a normative dimension, and certainly any action that counts as killing somebody has a rather thick normative dimension. Thank you. Yes, Tim.
I'm very grateful to Dr. Carter for expounding the Libe arguments so clearly, because I think she's shown us that there's, apart from all the other holes, there's a very simple way out at the first premise. The first premise of the argument as you set it up is the paradigm case where we think we have freedom, or perhaps the only case where we're tempted to have, we think we have freedom, is the case where there's a conscious decision and then we act on the strength of this conscious decision, which appears to present us with alternatives. And I think that's just false. I think that's just a very naive picture of how action happens. 2 examples. I'm playing tennis. The opponent puts the ball in an easy place, so I play a drop shot. I don't make a decision about this, but I've got no temptation to think it's not a free action. Or again, I'm engaged in high-speed philosophical badinage with some people in the bar late at night at a conference, and I just come out with some response. And when I think about it afterwards, I can see it was a good response. But I'm not tempted to say that I make a decision before doing this. So I just think the first premise of the argument is false. So we needn't go any further.
Rita, do you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm just interested, as we're talking about different things entirely. Free, you say that if you take a drop shot, for example, or say something in the bar, even if you didn't make a conscious decision to do it, or knowingly make a conscious decision to do it, that you wouldn't be tempted to say that it therefore wasn't free. I want to know, what is it not free of? What, in what sense is that action free? What makes you think you could have done otherwise?
No reason not to think that.
Losing it, can't hear.
Sorry, I think it's free because I could have done otherwise. I see no reason to think anything else.
Can I pick up? The sport's a good example. May I have the microphone just for the sport example? Because I think it's a very good one. Oh, thank you. Because in sport or in philosophical badinage, you often do things you surprise yourself. And you think, gosh, I didn't do it, it happened. It thinks, therefore I'm not, the old joke. And it seems to me that sport is a supreme example. Supposing I catch a ball, there is absolutely no way I could have done the following things. Flung my body into space to intersect with the ball, kept my hand sufficiently open to catch it, but not so open that it would bounce out, have a little bit of impedance so that the thing doesn't, etc., etc. There's no way I can do all that. So, my body did. Round of applause for Tallis's body, no round of applause for Tallis. Not so. Because where the decisions were made were in the previous winter, where I spent hours badgering Mummy to take me into the nets so I could practice and practice and practice. So all your decisions in relation to drop shots, you got to the point where you didn't have to make a decision. And just like when you're learning the piano, you become somebody who can do automatically, not entirely automatically when you're playing the piano. So in other words, one of the great things that our great freedom lies in the ability to train ourselves as fluent automatons in many situations.
Voluntary action expresses character, not choice, always.
The lady in blue in the middle. Yes.
About the Libet experiments, what would Libet think caused the readiness potential to happen when it happened?
I don't know what Libet thought, and it would be impractical. I can't imagine how one could possibly set up a neuroscientific experiment to see all the things that created the readiness potential. But it would be, I think you would find the drawing together, pulling on the memories, the know-how, the know-that, all the things that Ray talked about, which is already essentially in your brain, encoded in your brain, pulling those things together to respond to a stimulus which requires a response. And the response is first marked by the readiness potential, which, if you like, is a drawing together of all those things. It's a pulling on memory, it's a pulling on motor skills, it's a pulling on this, it's a pulling on beliefs and ideas, which is why they can act as stimuli in themselves. It's pulling all those things together.
That doesn't
I don't
answer
know how you would see that in the brain, but if you're saying what kicks off the readiness potential, I would say it's the stimulus.
But the stimulus being?
Whatever the stimulus of that cues the action
That's
is.
what I'm asking, because the timing, the timing of it happening just then when he's doing this experiment and he's been asked to do it, what determines just when it happens? That's my question.
Well, I think the honest answer is that one doesn't know exactly all the things in that person's life, all the field of prior intentions, beliefs, learning, everything that has gone towards making up that person at the moment in that laboratory. Which of those things are playing into this moment in time that makes him do it at that moment and not another moment. But I don't think that it comes from nowhere. I mean, I think this ties in with you, I think, started talking by saying that we're looking in the wrong place to look in the brain for free will. My question to you is, if we're looking in the wrong place, where do you suggest we look? Where do you find it?
Well, I don't think it's located in a place. I don't think it's sort of next door to the brain, 6 feet above it.
No.
But I mean, I think this is a very good question, because if you translated readiness potential into the up for it potential, you'd ask what makes you up for it, and that brings in the whole of the person's life, coming to the laboratory and so on. So I think it's a good question. The fact that your readiness potential occurs at that moment isn't absolutely like a little epileptic fit that happens. It actually is part of your taking part in the experiment. And I think in a way that's the killer question.
Well, no, it's very difficult. But what I'm trying to get at is, if you do not find the initiation of actions or acts within the physical organism, you seem to be suggesting that is the wrong place to do it. Sorry. I'm so sorry. I was asking that if you do not look within the physical organism for the initiation of it, for free will, if you're not looking there, that's the wrong place to look, and it's elsewhere, how does that, in that case, give that physical organism agency if it is not within it?
Again, I don't think agency is the kind of thing you'd find in a particular place. If you did, it would be doomed to be part of the causal net, which is not agency.
Gentleman in the black has the highest readiness potential, I think.
I'm trying to see if we can all agree on something. I wonder if we could agree that the interpretation of the Libet experiment collapses once we are not committed to the idea that something like just pressing or flexing your wrist hundreds of times, incidentally, because the readiness potential is an average of many responses. Hundreds of times when you feel like it is not done by a sort of Cartesian us making a decision which is then passed on to the brain. Because I think there are all sorts of reasons, philosophical and scientific, for doubting that Cartesian view of things. And once you doubt that, the whole experiment is a nonsense.
Yeah, that's right.
And that, in fact, was the original reaction to Libet amongst neuroscientists. This was a naive, elderly neurosurgeon doing a daft experiment that depended on old-fashioned philosophy.
I don't think I'm sorry, but I don't think I followed. Could you just, if you've still got the mic there, could you just say that first bit again? Committed to what?
Okay. What are you doing in the Libet type experiment? You're saying to the subject, I want you to press a button when you feel like it, and I want you to do it hundreds of times. Why should that task be done for each of the hundreds of presses? A sort of Cartesian you makes a decision, now is the time to press it, and tells the brain to do that.
Who says it's a Cartesian you that one is bringing to bear here?
Because there's no reason to expect the subject to be able to tell you when they made that decision for each button push, unless you're thinking in a Cartesian mode.
I think perhaps one way of putting it might be this, Rita, that Libet's experiment might be relevant if the conception of free will was of, as it were, the ghost in the machine, which has to start doing stuff and then the machine will follow. But that's the wrong conception of free will. There are many other more sophisticated ones on which the Libet experiment does not bear at all.
Well, I do agree that it is that concept of the ghost in the machine is the wrong one. I'm afraid it's the one that most people hold, and I'm talking about free will not in the way that it is understood, not in a sophisticated way, but in the way that I think it is probably understood by the vast majority of who do actually, it does affect their lives. It affects real things in the world. That very simplistic, simple and naive, and we all agree, incorrect idea of the ghost in the machine. And that is the form of belief in free will that I believe Libet does address, the Libet experiment does address and does challenge. I'm sure there are many more sophisticated ones. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not aware of them. I'm talking about something very commonsensical, ordinary understanding of it.
I'm going to allow Chairman's privilege and allow myself a question for Raymond. It seemed to me there was a stronger and a weaker version of what you were saying, and I wasn't quite sure that which one you would opt for. It's quite clear that you're right, I think, that, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that, but I believe you're right that the language of action and reasons and intentions and the whole human description of people is an entirely different kind of language. It's kind of a different description of the organism. It's the description of the organism as a person, and it's got its own vocabulary and its own modes of proceeding. That's one thing. That's a sort of weak claim, and I think you get a lot of agreement from most philosophers in the audience. There seemed to be a slightly stronger claim in the offing, and I just wondered whether you were committed to it. And that was the idea that because of that, we shouldn't anymore see ourselves in the light of elements within a large physical nexus upon which our doings supervene or out of which our doings emerge. And that seemed to me a much stronger view because it did flirt with a sort of ontological dualism, a slight sense that we transcend the physical. And I took it that would be an entirely separate claim and one to which you really didn't want to be committed. But could you alert me on that?
It's a bit like a PhD vibe in this case, sort of. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I feel totally robust about the weaker claim. I do feel very strongly about the stronger one, but I feel tantalized that I can't articulate it properly, and I certainly was conscious of articulating badly. It does seem to me that there are dangers with the stronger claim that one will start drifting into some kind of dualism of some sort. And indeed, I mean, I feel that Cartesian dualism is just as bankrupt as, neurodeterminism or neural monism or materialism. I feel there's something to be said about the kind of creatures we are that are not captured by a causally closed world. I can't say it properly, and I'm looking for somebody who can. And perhaps there are people who recently said things who having examined the philosophy of action can go a little bit further and draw some ontological conclusions. My current position is I'm an ontological agnostic, that's to say a mess at the deepest level.
Very good philosophical place to be. Gentleman right on the second row from the back, I think, up the right there. Yep.
I can make one comment about your question. You could endorse kind of a non-scientific naturalism, like Nietzsche did, and say that we are natural beings, but what we are is not completely told by natural science. And then my question to Rita Carter was also about the action theory, actually. So you said in your interpretation, the moment of action is something in time, but Aristotle already said that in a moment nothing happens because a moment doesn't have an extension. And this is, I think, also reflected by Wittgenstein, who said when we begin an action, it doesn't have a mental volume. We just do the action, but we cannot tell when we started to get up, for example. We just got up. So there is no beginning in time to that action, and therefore, for the Libet experiment, you can't distinguish between these different, when it gets conscious and when it gets initiated, because if you analyze the concept of action, you have that moment where the action begins, which doesn't have a temporal extension. And that would challenge your interpretation that it actually refutes acting free from the analysis of the concept of action, not of free will.
to answer? No. I'm not quite sure that the question is sharply addressed to either. Neither of you want to take it? We'll take one more before 12:30. Oh golly. Which part of the audience have I been unfair to? The gentleman in the T-shirt there, the purple haze of consciousness, the purple haze of T-shirt.
This is a question to either of you about the experiments that about the action potential in the cortex. So a lot of decision-making research shows that a lot of the decision-making processes are from a different parts of the brain, from the basal ganglia, and that a lot of action selection and motivation comes from oscillations in the basal ganglia, which would that would very much be in line against the idea of the ghost in the machine making the selection, but a previous decision made many times, a previous intention that is then mediated through these oscillations in the basal ganglia. And my question is, has there been any research done specifically in the basal ganglia, in the spiraling networks of the basal ganglia, to do with decision making that then leads to action selection, that then leads to activating the cortex? Has this been done in more detail?
I think there has, but I'm sorry, I don't have chapter and verse of it. Do you? Ray does.
There's a huge literature on the basal ganglia, and in particular in the initiation of movement. And it's been driven by studies of Parkinson's disease, because one of the things about people with Parkinson's disease is they're not able to initiate movements. And there's some very interesting changes in the behavior of the basal ganglia, and indeed the relationship to the premotor cortex and the supplementary motor area, various areas. So there's a lot of work done in it, but I don't think, again, it has any traction on this question of free will. Of course, the brain is a functioning brain is a necessary condition of expressing our free will. You know, chop my head off, and you won't get any good choices out of me. So I mean, so the fact there has been such work, and the fact that in Parkinson's disease, for example, you're not able to initiate actions, doesn't itself seem to me to have any kind of implications for the kind of argument we're having today.
I think we ought to call a halt now. It's gone 12:30, and thank both our speakers for a very entertaining session. Right, we reconvene at 2 o'clock, I believe.